Start now. Recording. One of the things I wanted to do to start was to review the sessions that we've had so far, the 12 sessions. I had the experience over the last couple of days of watching all of those again. I think one of the great things that Jessica did was that she made these available. You know, it's always kind of, there's sort of a little difficulty in getting the recordings of these sessions. I really recommend them. And so she made these, the names of the sessions, links to the recordings of the sessions. So I just went through all of them. And it was a big sacrifice for me because I'm a movie nerd. And so I couldn't watch any movies over the last couple of days because these were, it was about 14 hours of watching this time. But I was just struck by just the sort of the enormity of what we've done here. And I wanted to take a little time to go through each of these sessions and just mention what they were. And you know, if I really got into it, I could take probably the whole session talking about them. So I wrote down a couple of things I wanted to say about each of these sessions. So we started in July of last year. So this has been a year doing this. And the first session was done by Don. And it was really kind of a test session in a sense, because Don was the person who developed the outline for how we were going to do these sessions. So he was both testing this, but also giving us information. Really an excellent presentation. He's really good at this. So the title of that session was Accelerate Actions Needed for a Healthy Planet. And what he did was he used this framework that we have for these sessions, but presented his approach for getting climate action now. And I don't know if I have this here. And this was kind of a test for a book he was doing, which has come out recently from that. It's called Solve Climate Change Now. And I really recommend it. It's just, and one of the, because it's simple and direct and everything else. And he got really a good discussion going. I was really impressed right from the start at how people just sort of got into it and challenged him and gave him a lot of information. In August, we had Paul Schmidt in a session called Global Forest Recovery Coming to a Planet Near You. And it had both of those aspects to it. He really stated very clearly, and he knows a lot about this, as does Paul, as does Tom, about the kind of the heart of the problem in our world today of the forest disappearing. And one of the points he made was that just planting trees was not the thing to do, was not the final answer. And there's a lot of greenwashing done by people who just are planting trees with no real outcome. But that the focus really should be on preserving the old growth forests and preserving new forests too. And then Don came back again to this session, what will it take to mobilize meaningful action to achieve planet health? And the neat thing that he did in this, and this happened in a couple of sessions later on, was just ask questions and got us in terms of talking about this situation. And one of the main questions was the question of the session: what will it take to mobilize meaningful action to achieve planet health? But he had a lot of other ones that kind of teased out that. Then in October, we had Karen Buckley with Lewis Perkins of the Apparel Impact Institute, and reducing the climate impact of clothing and apparel industry. And one of the things that became obvious is that this was kind of a theme that came up, that one of the things that COP26 didn't explicitly work on, but really came out, that doing work industry by industry is really one of the best ways to deal with this, and with this climate crisis. And Lewis Perkins and the Apparel Impact Institute is doing amazing work in terms of bringing groups together and bringing the whole industry together, and enlisting collaboration, and really getting things done. And one of the things that came out of this session was that there was a project that they did, in which they could show corporations how they could save money. It was just kind of a test thing, and it was kind of, we talked about it as the gateway drug, because once corporations began to see how this could happen, then they could be induced into further activity. And that's resulted since then. And Karen Buckley in the next session, the follow-up session to that in November, talked about how Lewis has developed initially a $250 million fund that will grow to $2 billion to make changes in that industry, which accounts for about 10% of the of global warming effects and that sort of thing. And it's probably more than that, because of all the things that are happening in that industry. And then we did a session that was kind of like the session today, which is not focusing on any one particular speaker, but revolves around a question, which is what gives you hope, in that case in December. And that was an assessment of where we were and what gave us hope. And I recommended this to people as a possible one to look at, because of the really the inspiration that came out of that session. A really hard look at what was happening, but and how difficult things were, because it was an assessment at the end of the year. But then also from that, the little parts of hope that were there. In January, Frank Foti, the title of the session is Putting the Human Race Back into the Definition of Nature. But some of you probably know, and certainly those of you who were at this session, that Frank has embarked on this amazing project in Oregon, in one county in Oregon, where he has, I think it's maybe 400 acres or something like that, to work on. And he has a farm that he set up there. He's building retreat centers, walking paths and things like that. But it's not a normal retreat center. It's something that is working with the community. So there are two towns in that county, and he's putting in hotels in those areas, and restaurants, and he's working with the local people, with indigenous people there, and it's just an amazing project. So I really recommend looking at that to kind of blow your mind. And we're going to probably get back to Frank, because he has a lot of work to do. Some of the buildings are going to be completed in in November and going forward in the next year. So the whole thing won't be together at once. And one of the things he said is that he could get people from Portland, companies and so on. He's been approached by them. They want to do retreats there and everything else. He said, no, that's not what we're doing. We're not a corporate retreat center. We're there to help people who are doing work and are feeling the effects of the climate crisis. And then we had Alon, and I don't have much to say about that session. It was kind of a throwaway, but just joking, Alon. But it was really centered to what we've been talking about. It's come up over and over again in the work that Alon has been doing with the Elder Action Network. And I think, I don't want to embarrass you at all, Alon, but one of the things that came from that, and it was really deep and wide ranging and talked about connections with youth and the idea of regeneration came in, which is really key in nature and related to nature and everything else. But as I said, I don't want to embarrass you, but one of the things that came from this, and there have been a couple of people in these talks who have had situations when they've nearly died and been given another chance at life. And Alon, like other people, I think Tom is another example of this, decided, well, what am I going to do with this extra life that I've been given? And this is his response to that, which has been deep and wide ranging and has inspired all of us. Then we had a session, which is another one that I recommend to people, which is, can we reach a tipping point on climate action? This was amazing to me because it really brought in a lot of people who talked about the personal aspects that we have to hold to in this climate, and things like, in order to really get things done in this, we have to walk our talk. And people talked about how we can't just, in the first place, we can't just talk about this. But if we're taking action, there's a need to be integrous with this. And so we have to do things in our own life that represent our moving around our life to be able to suggest this to others. We have to be really solid in that. And one of the things I've noticed in the people talking here who have run these sessions, and it goes through every single person, they've changed their life around. They're doing things to prevent, to really minimize their carbon footprint, and that allows them to be able to really go forward in terms of what might be useful. Then we had a session with Joseph Jaworski called The Accidental Environmentalist, and there were so many things involved in this session that were really key. But I think the thing about it is that it turns out that Joseph, even though he talks about himself as the accidental environmentalist, is doing amazing work in terms of setting up the structures that might happen in really bringing out effective climate action. And I think the key aspects that I remember from this is that this was an amazing journey with clear findings and recommendations for focusing on the crisis. And one of the things that he emphasized, which has come out over and over again, is the need for the importance of being in nature. That's come up over and over again. And he's done a lot of work with people and kind of turning point aspects with people going into nature. And once they do that, there's a change. There's a change in terms of dealing with the climate crisis. And he talked about the issues, and we talked about, because each of these sessions has a tremendous amount of interaction, about bringing all representatives of a system to the table, and making sure that everybody is there when they're doing this work, and holding the container for doing this work, and holding it long term. One of the things that came out in discussion is it's very hard to hold the container for that and keep people going. But we discussed that, and that was important. And then we had a couple of other reasonably useless sessions with Tom Eddington. But but I think that you know, there's so much I can say about what you presented to us, Tom, but and you know, the title of the first session is something that I hope we can discuss today: this arrogance, ego, fear, ignorance, and one man's ecological adventures. Because you know, Tom presented as probably no one else can, very few people can, the real aspect of what's going on, and what the key really intense needs are, and what's going on in the environment, and the idea that some people say that it's too late anyway, but he presents these things in terms of what the issues are, that gives us a chance to be able to work on what might be done. And he presented, in addition to that, in terms of the depressing stuff, things that could be done, and a lot of those were brought out in his session. And then the June session was really about chocolate and coffee and other keys to discovering effective climate action. This was kind of a strategy session in which, using Tom's knowledge of the system, as to where are the places that we can really have an effect. Clearly, it's not going to be working with governments or corporations, except for the kind of thing that Lewis Perkins was doing in a particular industry. But where can we mobilize people? And there was for instance, Tom talked about that there are three major contributors to climate, the climate crisis. One is the food industry. That's probably the biggest one. The next one is airlines and transportation. And the last thing is energy. So if we took apart the food industry, for instance, one of the things that came up, Tom quoted somebody I'm forgetting her name, as usually happens to me, who said that, you know, we very often get in a depression, which is one of the things I was talking about today. I want to talk about today, in looking at the total picture, and but we can get out of that depression by doing local action. And when you look at the food industry, the idea of chocolate and coffee, the reason Tom mentioned those is that those are the only thing that needs, probably the only things, maybe there are some other ones, but that needs to be shipped from locations where these things are grown. But what's really happening is that we're shipping everything everywhere. So we have, you know, blueberries from Venezuela in the winter, you know, and that kind of thing. And so we're shipping things all over. And one of the solutions to that, one of the possible solutions to that, is to have people grow things in their area. So we skip the shipping and everything else, and we can talk more about that. But these kinds of solutions came up when we were talking about this, realistic solutions. So I wanted to talk about that in introduction, and I wanted to also say something about the title of this session is how can we best cope with the climate crisis and take action? And the first part of that is something that came up in these sessions over and over again, the personal psychology of doing this, the idea that we can get into depression about this, and we come in and out of this. And I want to say, for my personal feeling, the most recent time when I got into depression about this was when the Supreme Court did this. I think it was it West Virginia or Iowa or something like that versus somebody, which led to this decision they made that the Environmental Protection Agency can impose restrictions on coal plants in terms of what they're putting out into the atmosphere. And I thought, God, I read this an article in the New York Times about the whole history of the effort of industry and conservatives and mainly Republicans over a long period of time in terms of putting together, restricting the number of judges that Obama could put in, and stopping him from putting in Merrick Garland, and then all the judges that President Trump was able to put in, including the 3 Supreme Court justices and all the work they're doing in all the states and everything else, to come to this ability to stop work on climate. And I got into a real funk about that, because I'm looking at this and thinking, well, it's unlikely that the Democrats are going to be able to come out of the midterms with control of the Senate and the House, and then we're left with 4 years of no action on climate change when we really need to have that done. And so that resulted in kind of a real down period for me. And I think we all get into these kinds of situations. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about. And basically, I'd like to have us tell stories. I want to do one other thing here before we get into this. And that is that Paul Schmidt sent me a note this morning. He wasn't able to be here, but and Tom, you'll appreciate this, because he also, as well as you and my partner and I, read the Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo every day. And so the one he took his morning walk, Paul did, and then he read Mark Nepo, and he said, this Mark Nepo thing for June 19th, and for July 19th, it really represents something of not a solution, but a recognition of what we're going on with this issue of getting into depression as we work on this. So, and this Book of Awakening, I don't know if you know what this is, but it's a daily reading that comes from Mark Nepo, and it has a meditation connection with it, which I won't do. But so given that we have this issue of depression and what we can do about it, And this is called the wisdom in blinking. And the little thing he says at the beginning, asleep too long, we need to wake. Awake too long, we need to sleep. We blink 1,000 times a day, 1,000 times a day the world goes dark, 1,000 times a day we wake. We can't escape this opening and closing. It's a reflex we can't control. Even as you read this, your eyes along with your heart and mind are blinking, opening and closing repeatedly, no matter what you do. It's part of being human. Yet so much depends on what you see as home, being open or closed. Do you see life as one stream of light interspersed with nights of dark, or as one stream of darkness interspersed with days of light? Though there will never be an answer, what we believe about the nature of life matters. It lifts or burdens our days. So ask yourself more than once, is life one long miracle of feeling interspersed with moments of breaking? Do we repeatedly fall in our humanness from a never-ending light? Or is life one long, painful breaking interspersed with moments of wonder? Do we struggle up from the unending dark briefly into glimpses of light? Obviously, there are times we feel one way and times we are certain it is the other, but there are even times we know it is both. But how we allow for both, how much we make the light of our home and how much we settle into the dark determines the personal alchemy of our hope and despair, our optimism and pessimism, our belief and doubt. My journey has been mixed. Entering surgery, I was certain life was dark and I couldn't keep my eyes open. But walking from the surgery, I was certain that all had changed while I was under. Now everything was buoyant and I could barely close my eyes to rest. The same thing has happened when losing love. I feel closed and dark and unable to open. Yet falling in love has always made life one singing interval of light during which I can barely sleep. Perhaps the wisdom in blinking is that it keeps us in the middle, keeps us from drowning in the dark and from burning up in the light. Perhaps this is a reflex that lets us make sense of being human. So I ask everybody to think about what stands out for you in these sessions and what key insights you have now in terms of what is necessary in dealing with climate change, and that would be really helpful in terms of our looking at sometimes looking at the dark side. And what are commonalities in the work and the individuals that have come from these sessions, or in your own experience if you haven't seen these sessions? And then what inspires you for next steps you want to take, and that you can think you think your community and the nation and the world should take in climate action. So let's start with that as a prompt.
Michael, could you either repeat the prompt or put it in the chat?
I don't know if I can. Those are the questions that are at the end of the maybe I guess I can repeat it. Yeah.
I can put them in the chat for you.
Okay, I appreciate that. But I'll repeat it again. I think that's a good thing. What stands out for you in these sessions? And I'm saying again, you don't have to go to all these sessions. What stands out for you now is key to that. Are there key insights you have of what is necessary now in dealing with climate change? That's really the most important thing here. What key insights do you have of what's necessary now in dealing with climate change? And what are the commonalities in the work and the individuals that have come from these sessions? And then what inspires you for next steps you want to take and that you think your community and the nation and the world should take in climate action? What are the best practices or key targets you have noticed? I think that's enough.
Yeah, each of those is a huge question that could absorb the time entirely. I would just make a quick comment, which is to say, I was really impressed by each of the presenters and the stories behind them about how inspired the people, each person is. You know, there's a real sense that there's that it's not just them, their ego. There's the sources present and active with and through them in what they're doing that energizes it, and that each person is finding her or his own path in dealing with these issues. And I guess what comes to my mind, and you know, it's not only pressing the EPA Supreme Court decision, but then Joe Manchin pulling out of the deal to get a climate in the reconciliation bill. It just really told me that, okay, this is all on all of us. No one's going to solve this for us. The Supreme Court isn't, the legislators aren't. We're going to have to mobilize ourselves through the actions that we take, and in turn, how we engage others in our community to get enough people concerned about this enough that they will start a parade that the elected officials or would-be elected officials want to join. So I view it as a rallying call for us. It is, I guess, I'm interested in that Nepo's view about the dark and the light. I guess I live in the light and discount the dark. It's just intervals in the light. So that's just my outlook on life. But it's I think a call to us to renew, extend, and increase the things that each of us is doing, and to invite others. So it isn't just like, okay, this is what I'm doing, but how am I inviting, and how many other people am I inviting into what's meaningful for them to be doing? Because we just don't have enough people who are supporting this, and so we don't get enough legislators that are willing to put themselves on the line, and then we don't get action, and it all goes from there. The Supreme Court didn't say the EPA couldn't regulate these things. It just can't regulate them in the absence of congressional direction. So, and that all comes back on us. You know, we've had legislators that have essentially been AWOL on climate issues, you know, stuck and not acting, and we gotta loosen that up.
If I could second your point, Dawn, about invitations and tapping people on the shoulder. Obviously, this is my first time in the group, so I can't speak to two of those points, but something that's really intrigued me recently, and what brought me to this group after recently joining the Guild. I've been reading a book by Wes Jackson, if anybody's familiar, Becoming Native to This Place. His background is in geology and agriculture, and it's a bit older. It was published in 1994. And I see him as a very deep theoreticist in this arena. And speaking to Michael's point as well, that the purpose of an invitation in hearing that is for those that have opted out. I know a lot of folks in my generation, it's simply emotionally overwhelming. So it's easy to opt out, just as you would with any other pattern of emotional exhaustion, such as classism or racism. I think if you aren't directly involved and somebody near you isn't tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, here's an angle in, would you think about this with me? Would you participate with me? Would you help me figure this out? So that makes a lot of sense. And speaking on Wes Jackson for a moment, this is probably one of the most impactful books I've read in the last 2 or 3 years. And to speak on the second question about what inspires me, and what I think is important, I've been reading a lot in this book about framing the current economy as extractive. We're basically dipping into old pockets of energy versus newer pockets of energy, and we're throwing those energy packages into the black hole that is the economy. And he quotes Francis Bacon at one point about how shifting our attention then to what is the inquisition of truth, and it's not looking in the corners and niches of nature, it's seeing it as a whole. And there's specifically a line where he talks about how looking at the history of around the 1970s, when we were focused on chlorofluorocarbons and we thought they were non-toxic and very safe and great, and then learned, through our Cartesian worldview that, it got us where we wanted to be economically, but not so much otherwise. And he argues that we should remember our past to hope for second chances, to keep the scale of our projects small, so insert permaculture and community building and land banks in our cities, and to be ready to back out when things go sour, versus pushing for constant growth. So post-growth and permaculture, I think, stand out to me as arenas of immediate value. He continues and says, here lies my worry. Most proposals for bringing about a sustainable agriculture and culture carry the fingerprints or markings of that Baconian Cartesian worldview. At best, it amounts to a smart resource management. With such a mindset and with the institutions and genetics of culture in place to accommodate that worldview, attempts to break out of that paradigm will be frustrating. So he's basically saying we might just have to completely break off and do our own thing if at the point we become very frustrated with the bigger picture. And in those smaller changes, such as permaculture or post-growth theory, we might find avenues outside of that. So I kind of come from a place where I'm eager to learn from you all and have conversations about when the exhaustion of the bigger picture becomes too broad for us as individuals. How can we tap each other on the shoulder and focus on our food and our land, and not dipping into old energy pockets?
That's great, Anastasia. There's a lot in these sessions, if you have some time to look at them, that really deal with those aspects. The idea of taking local action that really means something, in a larger context. The chlorofluorocarbon aspect is something that back in the 90s I wrote about it because I was doing these papers on new paradigm business at the time, and I used as an example a lot of examples from the environment, but one was the hole in the ozone layer that happened at that time, and it was affecting South America. Cows were going blind. It was just an amazing sort of situation of degradation and everything. And then what happened is, and I don't have the whole history on this, is that chlorofluorocarbons began to get banned, and the hole in the ozone layer closed, and now it's opening up again because there's some new form the form that we're using to replace chlorofluorocarbons is a problem too, but that has a really interesting history. And one of the things I pointed out was that that nature contributed to it too, to the hole in the ozone layer, because there was a tremendous volcanic eruption at that time that increased the hole in the ozone layer too. So it's this balance between what we can do and what nature is doing, and it brings up this aspect of really getting into nature that that came out of these sessions. Okay.
I'll just say a couple of things. Within the Elders Action Network that you referred to, Michael, in the session I led, we're now going more deeply into so what it takes to adopt a deep, a regenerative set of values and worldview, and that translated into daily actions. And I find myself in some of the research I've done and conversations I've had with colleagues, that there is a lot of inspiration that can be found in the indigenous worldview. And by indigenous, I don't mean just Native American worldview, indigenous worldviews most of the time. And actions, it seems to me, are based on the way we view things, and that's what makes sense to us. So I came across recently a book that I find extremely worthwhile. It's called Restoring the Kinship Worldview, and I'll put it in the chat, by a Native American called Four Arrows and a lady that writes with him. And he contrasts what he calls the dominant worldview, which is basically inherited from the Enlightenment and beyond that, and the indigenous worldview in a more generic sense. And that's quite interesting. Things like focus on self and personal gain versus emphasis on community welfare, or materialistic, non-materialistic. In a sense, and we are trying to introduce now a first module on that. What does it take, and why is it important to question one's values and worldview, knowing that there is not you can think of it as something sliding between the dominant worldview and the indigenous worldview. So I won't say too much more about this, but I think there are a number of resources that help us self-assess into where am I, how am I thinking, and what does it lead me to do. So I don't want to say much more about this, but the need at this time to go to the root causes of our predicament, not just to deal with the symptoms of it, is very important. And for me, one of the ways, or a key way, is to go to that level of how do I see the world influence my actions and the actions of the communities in which I'm part of. So just wanted to add that. And I also recommend another book, since we've mentioned a couple of books, which is called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I think it's pretty much a bestseller at this time. And it offers views 20, 30, 40 years away that I think are very helpful in looking at the situation, and some of the radical solutions that have been adopted, hopefully. And it's a science fiction, but it starts from where we are now. And that's very challenging. So I would recommend these two sources to stimulate one's thinking. Just following what Anastasia did.
I'd like to share some stuff that's going on at George Washington University with students and faculty, and also some other organizations that I'm working with. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Wonderful. So I'm Julia Storberg Walker, and I participated early on, and then I had some conflicts with scheduling most of the last year, but I do attend when I can. So it's very meaningful to me, the work that you're all doing, and I appreciate it and have gratitude, so thank you. I'm a department chair in the Human and Organizational Learning Department in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, and my particular department area of focus is organizational learning and leadership and change. And the students we attract are master's and doctoral level students who are working in organizations or consulting that are focused on leading organizational change and learning efforts. So for example, chief learning officers, consultants, executive coaches. I've chaired 5-star generals as dissertation chair. We have a lot of military, you can imagine, in DC metro area. We have ministers, we have police officers, we have higher education professionals. So that we're kind of a domain of learning, leadership, and change that can cross sector boundaries. And I bring that up because we're kind of a unique department area, and sometimes our discipline is found in education, and other times it's found in schools of business. So a lot of the people I work with are business colleagues from across the United States and the world, and people in education don't like us because they associate with us with business, and people in business don't like us because they associate us with education. So we're the, you know, the ugly stepchildren wherever we go, and we kind of wear that as a badge a little bit. But we straddle this kind of interdisciplinary boundary, and most of us always feel a little outside whatever we're in, whatever discussion we're in. Which is kind of an interesting liminal space as a scholar and as an educator. And I'm learning, as I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, I'm learning the value of that unanchoring, that untethering, because I see the tight control in so many other disciplines about particular language, paradigm, mindset, and our students, we are more and more seeing the value of a nimble mindset. So like, for example, Donella Meadows said, the #1 lever for change is to change the mindset from which the system was generated, right? And to even recognize and hold lightly the idea of a mindset, because it's always partial, right? It's always from a perspective or a position. And our culture, our Western culture, you know, locks us in and prevents us from imagining alternatives. And so one of the gadfly type roles I have in my department is to push the agenda of this nimble mindset development in our students. And over the past, I would say 5 years, I've made inroads. And some faculty of my colleagues of mine are more receptive than others. And that's important because faculty resistance is an under-talked about, in my experience, an under-talked about thing that prevents change in specifically sustainability issues. If faculty don't understand human connection in nature, right, and human relations to nature, and the fact that we are interdependent, they're not going to be able to add value in terms of sustainability. So faculty development is important. That's an important thing. How I've been doing that is by just kind of pushing the agenda and doing different readings and bringing in indigenous scholars. I got a lot of professional development myself, and it's just kind of snowballed and grown and grown and grown. Growed, not groaned. That's interesting. Slip, I wonder what that means. But recently, one of the things we did was a colleague and I kind of snuck in to GW's new Sustainability Institute, which is very hardcore science, you know, Arctic science, energy science, but you know, chemicals, and a lot of their grants are very big, you know, National Science Foundation grants, and they have train the trainer or development kind of components to those grants, and they never thought of working with educators. And so our little niche in that is that we will be bringing this perspective, this educative perspective, into these grants, and doing things like place-based education. What is the role of place and land? What's the history of that? I got a question from an Arctic PI about, you know, how do we work with indigenous? Well, as a white woman, I can't really say, but I can connect you to some friends who might be able to know who are First Nations, you know? And so opening, it's being boundary spanners again and maybe being outsiders, but, you know, we're invited to the party and we're connecting people in new ways with this idea of decentering humans as separate from or central to things, right? When my experience has been when I really felt in my soul and my body that I was of nature, like I forget, someone said the phrase, "I don't have a life, life has me." And when I realized that life has me, it was a little frightening to see the powerlessness of that position and the being in the flow, and that, I think, is what Joanna Macy talks about, why we need gratitude first, right? We need to start with gratitude, then we can face that kind of terror of being out of control. And but anyhow, we weave these kind of ideas into our educational initiatives using language that can connect to the different stakeholder groups. And we're not perfect. Sometimes we mess up.
I want to let you go on, but I want to say, because it is at the hour and I don't want to lose, I don't want to lose Peter. I wanted to welcome you too. And because you haven't been here before. And Peter, I'm saying, welcome all of you, of course, but, I'm not asking you to necessarily jump in, but if you want to, that's all right, but I just wanted to welcome you. So go ahead, Julie.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was just blabbing. I get on a roll. The last thing I want to mention is another group is called the International Humanistic Management Association. Mm-hmm. And through Bob Chapman, who's the CEO of Barry Waymiller, he's funding a really interesting faculty development series, and they're building cohorts. And I'm in the first cohort, and it's an interesting model. We meet in person, we met in person at Fordham University in June. We're meeting weekly virtually. We meet again in September, and then the next cohort starts, and we mentor them. And they're using the word humanistic, but it really is all about what you're talking about, sustainability there, and how to be human and leave a good legacy for our ancestors. So there's a lot of different actions going on. So thank you for.
Yeah, that's really rich. And I've always thought that we might have a session with you leading a session, because I think there's a lot there. Although you've got to start on it today. No, that's great. So I'll open it for a little while, but I want to do a little bit of a summary. But anybody else who wants to say anything, Tom, Peter, but if you don't, I can fill in the time for sure. Not really.
I'll say hi. Sorry I was late. This is, for some reason, the schedule's just jammed right now for me, but I'm passionate about the topic, and where I'm going with it personally is digging into Boehm's work on dialogue, because I think the key issue here is until we figure out a shared meaning, nothing really changes.
Yeah. And that's a real theme that came up in this. And you know, Joe, if you haven't seen it, Joe Jaworski's session on this was really strong on Boehm.
Yeah.
And as you know, so I really recommend that. You know, that's really key. And that kind of, well, Tom, do you have anything? I was going to go into kind of a summary.
Yeah, I'll share just a couple of things. So the reference you made earlier, Michael, in the introduction was to Jane Goodall.
Yeah, that's right. I just blanked out on it. It's what happens with old people.
And you know, Jane's conversation, she acknowledged that for each of us, if we look at what's happening globally, it's overwhelming and it's easy to go to despair. And so her encouragement is to do stuff locally. And I completely embrace that. I know that that's part of the solution. But I also know that, you know, each of us as individuals doing things locally, if we get enough of that, then we can make a difference. But in the meantime, the world's being destroyed. And so a key point of leverage that I believe exists is through corporate action. And so getting corporations to, because they have so much power, so much control, and use so many resources. And so for me, it's constantly trying to figure out, and you know, and I've shared this before, so many CEOs I work with have said, particularly if they're publicly traded companies, write to me. That way I can go to the board and I can say, we have to do these things because we're going to lose customers. So I know that's a point of leverage for me. I'm continuing to try and figure out how to use that as a point of leverage. And I like what Lewis is doing, you know, industry vertical by industry vertical, because there's tremendous leverage and power there. Picking up on something that Don was sharing, you know, our democracy's on code red, our environment's on code red. And just picking up on your comment about Joe Manchin, I mean, I think it's emblematic of where we are, in that, you know, the Biden administration, the Democrats offered to Joe on multiple occasions, here's a package. Joe said, you know, make it smaller. So the package was made smaller. And he would, in each case, he would say, I'm happy to come on board if you'll do these things. And as recently as last Thursday, he was prepared to come on board. And then he backed out. And so that nobody in West Virginia who he represents is getting anything out of this. He personally isn't getting anything out of this. He could have had legislative victories. If the Democrats pick up Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in November in the midterms, then he becomes irrelevant. If the Republicans take control of the Senate, he becomes irrelevant. And so here's a guy who had tremendous power, who could have actually gotten something done, but he's so beholden to the system that he sacrificed the people of West Virginia and his own political power for what, I don't know. I mean, it's a complete and total curiosity for me, but it's emblematic of how broken things are. And so I wanted to pick up on some of those pieces and just put them into the mix. But you know, for me, I'm just seeing our democracy and our climate on code red flashing, and really trying to figure out how and what can be done. And I genuinely hear Jane and saying work locally, but it doesn't feel enough. Feel like enough.
I agree, and I want to underline what you said about Lewis Perkins. I mentioned a little bit about that, but that's the session with Karen Buckley and Lewis Perkins on the Apparel Impact Institute. And it's really amazing what he's doing. It's a model for how you could work within industries. And when you look at these industries, they're very important. I think I may have mentioned that that I think the data are that the apparel and clothing industry contributes 10% of climate degradation, and it's probably more. And they're just incredible, terrible things, like when they're responsible for a lot of taking down the forest, because to make rayon and polyester, they cut down thousands and thousands and maybe millions of trees to make those things. And the interesting thing about it is that they use 30% of what they cut out, and then the rest they just throw away. And so what Lewis is doing is getting collaboration across all the parties. It's not like working with one company or something like that. He's getting cooperation with all the parties involved, including some of the real bad actors, in a sense, like H&M with fast fashion and things like that. And I don't think they're going to change their model of doing business, but it's really a model for what might be done. And so, and to speak to the local action part of it, I think one of the things that was interesting that we saw in our session, the last session we did with you, Tom, is that if we look at food, and you're responsible for doing this in New Mexico, is that if we get people, and I agree with you, this is kind of a long shot, and getting people to do it is an issue and so on. During World War II, we had victory gardens and so on, and people did that because it was a big, because it was a real threat. It was an acute threat as opposed to a chronic threat, which is the environment. And but now the idea of having local people grow their own things and removing all the shipping costs and everything else is a real possibility. Could be, and I agree with you that it's not the total thing, and working with corporations is probably the best thing. But and it's really, the corporations thing is really there for the taking, because they really want to do this. There are people in corporations who want to do this. I think I don't know if it's you who brought it up, Tom, but somebody said that people in corporate. No, it was Tom Perkins in one of the sessions you did with Ubiquity. He was saying that they're saying, people leading these corporations are saying, I have grandchildren too. I have children and grandchildren too, and I know what's going on, and just give us something that will help us to do this. So that's kind of a sweet spot there. I don't know if this is the time to do that, but I wanted to mention some insights that I think came out of this that I got from looking through all of these. One is the aspect that a couple of you have mentioned of, and that I've mentioned too, of the inner psychology of people, and what it takes to do this, and how you have to have integrity in doing it, and then from that, the idea of collaboration keeps coming up over and over and over again. The need for collaboration, and I think one thing that you brought up, Tom, is that there are how many NGOs in the U.S. and how many in India?
There's just over 2 million here in the US and about 3.5 million in India.
Okay, so talk about collaboration there. I mean, all these organizations are seeking funding, doing the things they're doing and everything else. What would be the power of collaborating there? But also in doing the grunt work of doing this, the idea of collaboration. One of the things that came out too, over and over again, and it's part of, there's the Book of Hope by Jane Goodall, and she mentions what gives her hope. And I can't remember all of them. I think she said the innovative power of people, the generative power of regenerative power of nature, and something else. But one of the things was her tremendous hope that comes from youth, from young people, and what they're doing. And some people have talked about how people in what might be called the Zoom generation are going through educational programs like this. And I've seen this with my grandchildren, and where there's a lot of there are actually programs in high schools and in college and so on, and people are flocking to these and wanting to do something about it and seeing the points of this. And I don't know if I'm stepping out of line here, Anastasia, but I think you, in the comments you made, really represent that. You know, what you talked about is what we don't normally hear from that perspective in this group. And that's one thing that's come out of these things.
Yeah, maybe just picking up on that, Michael. As you know, I produced a film on the true story of humanity a couple of years ago. That we come into this world hardwired for collaboration and cooperation, and the key message of the film is that we're a nonviolent species, and all of the actions we're taking are, you know, in this extraction, picking up on Anastasia's comment earlier, all of this violent action against nature and the extraction of minerals and trees and everything else are counter to our hard wiring. It's in our DNA to be collaborative, cooperative species. And so a foundational piece of this for me is around how do we help people understand the true nature of our species, that we're a nonviolent species, and how do we bring nonviolence back into our consciousness. It's operating at a subconscious level, and it's an important piece of solving for this.
Is your film accessible publicly?
Yeah, it's. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
I want to add on to that. There's a book that's one of my favorite books called A Paradise Built from Hell. It's by Rebecca Solnit, and she's an amazing author on a number of counts. But what she looked at is these crises that have happened, earthquakes and hurricanes and fires and things like that, and pointed out that in those situations, people put aside all barriers between them and work together and do amazing things to help each other. And it speaks to the situation we're in, where those are acute situations and people do that. And I tracked this after 9/11, which wasn't in her book. And also I think she tracked it with the Mexico City earthquake that happened in 1985 and how long it lasted. I was writing about this maybe 4 or 5 years after 9/11 happened. And there still was this situation where New Yorkers before 9/11 would just walk on the street and have their eyes down. They wouldn't make eye contact and so on. And now what people were noticing is that people, especially people of different races, were looking at each other and talking to each other and things like that. And it may have gone away. I mean, after the Watts riots, people went out from all over Los Angeles, wherever it is, Beverly Hills and Watts and all that sort of place, and just cleaned fields. They just got together and went across and cleaned out the destruction and everything. Just amazing things that happened, going all the way back to the San Francisco earthquake, whenever it was, 100 years ago or something like that. But those are acute situations, and we get a lot of even government activity when there are wars going on and so on. So it's still we are hardwired to do that, but the idea is getting people to see this as an acute situation, getting them to appreciate that, and then appealing to their better natures. And I think the work that Don's doing is really representative of this too. Like, how can you get people to get involved and and work with these things. So.
And unfortunately, it seems that it requires that it move from chronic to acute to get people's attention.
Yeah. So how do we make chronic? But that's, how do we make the chronic thing acute? And I think people have experiences that would send them into that. And that's what we're talking about in this session on a tipping point. And one of the things that's interesting about this, I don't know if you talked about this, Tom, or somebody else did about, no, I think it was Don. Don, you talked about the percentage of people, you know, there's this statement by Margaret Mead that she made in 1978 that never doubt that a small group of citizens can change the world. In fact, that's the only way that it's been done. And so Don put sort of numbers to that. What is it that you were talking about? Like we need 25% to.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research done, and it's about 25%. What's interesting is that if you put in a nonviolent civil disobedience component, you can actually drop it down to 3.5% from the studies that have been done. So it depends on the level of activism that's associated with that advocacy, where those numbers come out. But there are substantial opportunities to make a difference. And, you know, I was struck by the comment that was made earlier in this conversation about how, you know, the conservative forces had worked for a decade or more, you know, to get in place the local support, to get in place the, yeah, Tom.
50 years. Lewis Powell wrote the doctrine back in 1972.
Yeah. Wow. So they've been working a long time at it. And we are feeling the press of climate change. And, you know, that shouldn't keep us from doing the kind of foundational work we need to do to bring about and to sustain the changes over time. Because I think actually that conservative movement that's given us the court we have and all sorts of other things, you know, that was people who stuck with that endeavor for the long haul. And now there's been a lot of people who've already worked on climate issues for decades. So maybe we have a few decades to our credit here. But, you know, if we have the willingness, here we are 2022, we have the willingness to take a decade of effort to build that foundational support through action, through advocacy, and through engagement of more people. What some of you were talking about, you know, tapping another person on the shoulder to join in. There is actually time. You know, I think sometimes talking about the acuteness of a problem takes our eye off the ball on what's needed to be done foundationally to bring about that longer term change, you know, because we never build something strong enough to carry it forward. So it'd be an interesting, I think there's great opportunity out there.
It's interesting how you talk about when you add the non-violence component, just as Everett Rogers talks about, you know, the diffusion of innovation. I think he uses other language, but non-violence is just like, you know, the perfect synonym for all the words he uses to talk about how to lessen that gap and kind of ethnographically make sure you're paying attention to where you're at before asking something of a population or a group. But in terms of the slow building, I think that's another big question I have, and I'm eager to continue to participate in this group too, is, you know, other than things like focusing on land, you know, of course there's the individual action, right? You know, with consumption and changing our own genetic values. And supporting those around us that share those values. But other than, you know, land purchasing and growing food, at a smaller level, I think I'm at a loss for, not that that's anything small, that's already half of it is food sovereignty. But what else is there to do in a community or in a city that we're in? Sounds like tapping folks on the shoulders in the private sector that have money, power, influence to use for social good. But other than the focus on food and regulation or policy, what else is worth building now or important to build now?
Well, I think on the corporate side, there are good examples like of Patagonia and what Patagonia is doing. You know, they're actually flying in the face of fast fashion. They're saying, don't throw our stuff out. They're sending, you know, vans around the country to go repair their zippers and buttons and whatever else on the things that they've sold to people. And they're getting a following for that because people, you know, people buy two things when they buy, at least thoughtful people, when they buy a piece of clothing, they buy what the piece of clothing is, and they buy the story behind the piece of clothing. And so we could mobilize, there are opportunities to mobilize consumers, and maybe this is something the Apparel Institute can do or whatever. Is really make, and I think others are doing that. Canopy Planet is doing that around fashion, to get the consumer to make a different choice. You know, to say, okay, I'm willing to pay what the full cost is of the clothes that I'm buying, rather than just what it costs to make the clothes and doesn't take into account throwing it in the dump afterwards and shortening its life. So I think there are a lot of different domains. I think the question is, how, and maybe this goes to Tom's point, is, you know, and all, how can we demonstrate to the corporate world that there are markets for these social values? Because not everyone's going to go for that, but you know, we can start to get some, and then as people see, oh, they're making more money over there doing the right thing, maybe more people would do the right thing.
Well, that's an interesting point too, just the culture creation as well, because speaking of a younger generation and greenwashing, it's interesting how things evolve and start to mix together. We're very clumsy as a species when it comes to our culture creation. But you talk about like demonstrative social value markets. And it's interesting to see a divergence now in where we're at modern day of, as you're saying, the Patagonia, where the value is clear, the action is clear, it's simple. That's that versus, I'm sure as many of you, or a few of you, worked or studied or talked about this in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, you've been repeating yourselves for decades, whereas now the language just shifts a little bit. There's a catalyst through consumerism or capitalism, and now everybody my age is harking something where maybe there's not deep meaning there, but the language is so, you know, overtly used. So I think that's another thing that's interesting, is this, like, you know, for instance, with Patagonia, clear, simple, deep rooted value, then there's a clear action. It's simple, I think, is a key for me, versus, you know, it's like this nuevo greenwashing that's happening where everybody and his brother and sister that's especially my age, they know the words, they know the language, they talk about it, but yet the consumption is still varied, or there's so many companies that sell, you know, quote unquote greenwash products that it's like, well, I buy 10 reusable Q-tips and give them as gifts and mail them. And it's like this weird mix of a desire to demonstrate, somebody to demonstrate they have the social value versus actually do it. That's a big gap I'm noticing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard to change people's thinking. It's easier to change small behaviors, but that small behaviors doesn't necessarily, those small behavioral changes don't necessarily mean, I think this is your point, Anastasia, doesn't necessarily mean that people have really changed their mindset.
Yeah, it's like the crux of virtue signaling with sustainability.
Mhm. It's true. One of the things I recommend that session with Lewis Perkins, because when somebody said at the end of it, he's bringing all these people together and all these companies together to do these things, which is really what needs to be done. And somebody said at the end of this, they never thought they'd see a presentation when Patagonia and Walmart were in the same phrase. And but that's what's happening, and to get past that. So they're the efforts of Patagonia and Eileen Fisher and all these other ones that are doing that kind of work. And then there's also the overriding thing of really cutting down what the climate effect of that whole industry. And
That's a great reminder. I'll definitely watch that. It reminds me of something that Bill Vogelsong does really well here in Cleveland. Is it's difficult to want to hold the hands of the Walmart sometimes.
That's right.
Which is arguably a form of violence, right? We other them, and
Yes.
we think they're beyond help. And I think something I'm learning now, and learning from mentors like Bill, is, it's hard work to want to hold their hands, but it has to be done, and you have to kind of slowly take the baby steps as they learn
That's right.
to walk, and it takes decades. And sometimes I joke with Bill that I don't have decades of any experience, so that's a hard timeline to understand. But
That's right. That's right.
That's love, I guess, right? Gotta love the Walmart people.
That's right. So do you think we've done it, Tom?
Yeah, I was going to say, I need to jump, and when I do, I'm going to take the recording with me. So, for the ability to record.
Okay, so Michael, what's next in your mind? Do you have a suggestion, or any of you have suggestions about what's next?
We're going to have to carry that out in individual conversations. I think I have a couple of things going on that are very interesting. One is, I don't know if this will actually happen, but a couple of members are working with the UN sustainable development goals, but they have another project which is individual development goals. And they've taken the point, which comes out of a lot of our sessions, that in order to really do this, people have to do some really strong inner work. And so they've set up this amazing thing where they've got, I don't know if I can do this. I want to put a link in the chat about this, but I can't do it right now. But it's an amazing program. They've enlisted all kinds of people involved in this, and they have 5 areas of personal development and 23 sub areas, and it's almost like the whole world, especially the leaders that would impact climate, will have to go on a self-development.
Sounds like emotional intelligence revisited.
Yeah, well, it's more than emotional intelligence. That's one of their 5. Anyway, I'm sorry, Tom. But that's something I have in mind, and we're working on.
Yeah, what popped in my head is Don asked the question was, it feels like creating a roadmap would be a useful tool. So not only for the personal, but as the collective, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be, and what are the individual steps each of us could be taking personally and professionally?
That's a great one.
Yeah, there was a lot of energy early on with this group about, results chains or theory of change kind of thing that could go right along with what you're talking about, Tom, which is, in other words, how do these things connect, and how do they get us from here to there, and how can that help surface the hypotheses that we have? so that we could be more explicit in considering and testing them, you know, versus just running around with a bunch of assumptions in our heads and hoping. Hope is good, but you know, checking it out is also good. So I think that that could be very worthwhile if, you know, maybe we never really did this very explicitly, but maybe if there's some people who would like to do that in domains that they're working on to illustrate that, and then, you know, that might be something we could do. I think it's also a pretty interesting question about, do we need to change how we think in order to change how we behave? That's an assumption that we're making, you know, that, okay, we have to change how people think in order to change how they behave. I'm not so sure that's the case, but it might be this case in certain circumstances, but I don't think it is in others. And it's hard to change what people think. No one in our culture today wants to have their thinking changed by somebody else. So there's a bunch of interesting issues, I think, that are around in this domain.
I liked what.
I encourage you to put something together. You know.
I like what Julia, some of her work around what she was calling nimble mindset and spanning boundaries. Because that feels like there's a couple of key pieces there that she could bring to this process.
I want to say also, Donna, maybe this is the way you feel about it, but to say, sounds like Emotional Intelligence Revisited is really a knock on this thing. It's just an amazing thing that they're doing. And
I want to get into it more. I'm glad that you're highlighting.
It's really worth getting in, and we'll see if I can pull the people together. Involves
are there people from our group who've been involved in that, or?
Yeah, Mary Gelinas is one of the main people, and then Alan Briskin, who's in the Conscious Leadership Guild, and then there's another. They're not the original people who've done it, but they're like thinking partners in sort of bringing this thing out, and they've got already the president of Costa Rica saying that he's going to input this into all his decision making and so on. So, and they had a thing with 3,000 people in April 29th. It's an enormous thing, and I just don't want to belittle it by saying sounds like Emotional Intelligence Revisited. It's really an important thing that I want to do. But I really encourage you to. I think you're onto something here with a roadmap and looking at that. I'm talking to you, Tom and Don.
Yeah, the other thing I'll throw into the mix is that I've been having a series of conversations with Michael Putz and his business partner, and they've developed a technology for assessing mindset.
Oh, that really sounds interesting.
And it's gone way beyond just a lot of the tools that exist today, whether it's any of the personal assessment tools, but it can, they have the ability to look at an organization mindset as well as the individual mindset. And it can be particularly useful from just from a leadership development or individual development perspective. Once you have a sense of where is your mindset, where do you take it from there?
Is it publicly available, or is it just a business tool this time?
Yeah, at this point, it's a business tool, and it's still, I would say, in beta form.
Okay.
But the couple of meetings I've had with them and what they've shared with me, I'm really curious and impressed with what they've been able to do with it so far.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have an interest in how they could apply that mindset thinking to, climate health?
They're still very much in the exploration stage of trying to figure out how and where to use it. Where's the biggest market needs, biggest market opportunities. And so I've been having conversations with them about potential applications of it.
Well, sounds interesting to learn about.
Well, I talked to him about doing a session because he had talked about vertical development, which is what the UN group is doing. And in fact, this UN thing came out of conversations that Michael and Mary and I were having about that. And so I'm sort of key to getting him involved in a session too. He's very, very clear and deep ideas about all these things.
Interesting. Wow.
I need to sign off. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Together.
This
Thank
was
you.
great.
Really
Yeah.
great.
Thanks, Tom and Michael, for organizing it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
all,
thank you.
Anastasia, great to have you in the group here.
Great
Yeah.
to meet you guys.
Yes.
Ready, wonderful.